September 3rd, 1937, Helena, Arkansas. A Friday night when the air was still thick with the heat of summer, even though September had arrived and should have brought some relief, some hint that fall was coming, that the oppressive weight of Delta summer would eventually lift, but not yet, not tonight. The heat hung over Helena like a blanket, making everything feel slower, heavier, more difficult than it should be. The Miller Hotel sat on Cherry Street in the heart of Helena's black business district, a 3-story brick building that had been constructed in 1923 and served as one of the few places where black travelers could find lodging in a town that was otherwise strictly segregated. The hotel had 30 rooms spread across the upper 2 floors, a small restaurant on the ground floor, and a large common room that served multiple purposes depending on the day and time. During the week, it was a gathering space where guests could sit and read newspapers or play cards or just escape the confines of their small rooms. On weekend nights, it transformed into something else entirely. The proprietor of the Miller Hotel was a man named Augustus Miller, who everyone called Gus, a shrewd businessman who understood that a hotel could be more than just a place to sleep. It could be a social hub, an entertainment venue, a place where community happened. So on Friday and Saturday nights, Gus would hire musicians to play in that large common room, would charge a small cover at the door, would sell drinks and food, would create an atmosphere that drew people from throughout Helena and sometimes from across the river in Mississippi. It wasn't quite a juke joint, wasn't quite a formal venue, but something in between. A respectable establishment where respectable people could enjoy music and socializing without the rough edges and potential dangers of the juke joints on the outskirts of town. The common room was rectangular, maybe 40 feet long and 25 feet wide, with a high ceiling that helped with the heat even if it didn't eliminate it entirely. The walls were painted a deep cream color that had yellowed with age and tobacco smoke. Windows along one wall looked out onto Cherry Street, their curtains pulled back to let in whatever breeze might exist, though usually there wasn't much. The furniture was simple but sturdy. Round tables that seated 4 to 6 people, wooden chairs that had been repaired and refinished multiple times over the hotel's 14 years of operation, a few upholstered chairs along the walls for people who wanted to sit and listen without claiming a full table. At the far end of the room, opposite the entrance, was a small raised platform that served as a stage. Just a wooden platform, maybe 6 inches high and 10 feet across, enough space for a musician or two to stand without being crowded. Behind the stage, the wall held something unusual for a place like this, something that made the Miller Hotel's common room distinctive: mirrors. 5 large mirrors hung on the wall in a row, each one maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, framed in dark wood that matched the other trim in the room. They had been installed when the hotel was built, a design choice meant to make the space feel larger, to reflect light from the windows and the electric bulbs that hung from the ceiling, to create an illusion of depth and expansiveness in a room that was actually fairly modest in size. The mirrors were old even then, salvaged from some other building or purchased second-hand, their silver backing slightly degraded in places, creating spots where the reflection was dimmer or slightly distorted. But they worked. They served their purpose. They made the room feel bigger and brighter than it actually was. On this particular Friday night, September 3rd, 1937, Gus Miller had hired Robert Johnson to play. Word had spread that Robert Johnson would be at the Miller Hotel, and people had started arriving early, claiming tables, ordering drinks, filling the room with conversation and laughter, and the anticipation that always preceded Robert's performances. By 8 o'clock, there were maybe 60 or 70 people in the common room, a good crowd for a Friday night, enough to make the evening profitable for Gus and ensure that Robert would be paid well for his performance. Robert arrived at 8:15, walking through the front door of the hotel, carrying his guitar case and a small bag that held whatever possessions he was traveling with. He checked in at the front desk, paid for a room for the night, and was given a key to room 23 on the second floor. He went upstairs, deposited his bag in his room, then came back down to the common room with just his guitar case. He was 26 years old that September, thin and intense as always, wearing dark pants and a white shirt that was clean but worn. His hair cut short, his face showing the strain of constant travel and the weight of whatever burden he carried that made his eyes look older than his years. Gus Miller greeted Robert at the entrance to the common room, shook his hand, discussed the arrangements for the evening. Robert would play 3 sets with breaks in between. He would get a percentage of the door receipts plus tips if people were feeling generous. He could eat from the kitchen for free and drink whatever he wanted within reason. The usual arrangement that Gus made with musicians who played at the hotel. Robert nodded his agreement, not saying much, never saying much, preferring to let his music speak for him rather than wasting words on small talk or social pleasantries. He made his way through the crowded room toward the small stage at the far end, acknowledging greetings from people who called out to him, nodding at familiar faces, but not stopping to talk to anyone. He reached the stage, stepped up onto the platform, set his guitar case down, and began preparing for the performance. Opened the case, pulled out his guitar, checked the tuning, made small adjustments to the strings. And that's when it started, though nobody noticed at first, though the wrongness wouldn't become apparent until later when Robert actually began playing and the impossible became undeniable. As Robert stood on that small stage, tuning his guitar, his back to the 5 mirrors on the wall behind him, something was already happening. Something that 5 people would witness and would never forget, and would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to others who weren't there, who didn't see it, who would struggle to believe that such a thing was possible. But before we get to those 5 witnesses and what they saw, we need to understand something about mirrors and reflection and the folklore that has surrounded these objects for as long as humans have been able to see their own faces looking back at them from polished surfaces. Mirrors have always occupied a strange space in human consciousness, a liminal zone between the physical and the supernatural, between what is and what might be. In cultures around the world, mirrors are associated with the soul, with truth, with portals to other realms. They reveal what is hidden. They show you yourself as others see you, rather than as you see yourself. They create doubles, duplicates, images that are you, but also not you, that exist in a space that is beside you but separate from you. In African American folklore that came up from slavery and before, that mixed African traditions with European superstitions and created something new in the crucible of the American experience, mirrors held particular significance. Covering mirrors when someone died was common practice, based on the belief that the soul of the deceased might get trapped in the mirror, might be unable to move on to the afterlife if it saw its own reflection. Breaking a mirror brought bad luck because you were breaking your own image, fragmenting your soul into pieces that would take 7 years to reassemble. And looking into a mirror at certain times, in certain places, under certain conditions, might show you something other than your own reflection, might show you the future or the past, might show you spirits or demons or aspects of yourself you didn't want to acknowledge, might show you truth that was uncomfortable or dangerous or damning. In the Delta in the 1930s, these beliefs were still strong, still influenced how people thought about and interacted with mirrors. It wasn't universal, wasn't something everyone believed with equal fervor, but it was there, an undercurrent of unease about objects that seemed to contain some essential part of yourself, that created images that were both you and not you, that existed in that uncertain space where the natural world touched something else. Robert Johnson stood on the stage with his back to those 5 mirrors, tuning his guitar, unaware that behind him his reflection was already behaving strangely. Not obviously wrong yet, not dramatically different from what it should be, just subtly off in ways that someone would have to be paying close attention to notice. The 5 people who would become the primary witnesses to what happened that night were scattered throughout the room, sitting at different tables, arriving at different times, having no connection to each other beyond being in the Miller Hotel common room on September 3rd, 1937. The first witness was a man named James Crawford. He was 34 years old, a railroad porter who worked the line between Memphis and Little Rock and had a layover in Helena that night. James had heard Robert Johnson play once before, about 6 months earlier at a juke joint outside of Clarksdale, and had been impressed enough to remember the name and seek out opportunities to hear him again. When James heard that Robert Johnson would be playing at the Miller Hotel, he made sure his route brought him through Helena that night, made sure he had time between trains to attend the performance. James was sitting at a table about 15 feet from the stage, slightly to the right, an angle that gave him a clear view of both Robert on the platform and the mirrors on the wall behind him. The second witness was a woman named Sarah Mitchell. She was 29 years old, worked as a seamstress in Helena, lived in a boarding house 3 blocks from the Miller Hotel. Sarah didn't usually attend the Friday night music shows at the hotel, considered them a bit too worldly for her tastes, a bit too close to the juke joint atmosphere she had been raised to avoid. But her sister was visiting from Pine Bluff and had insisted they go out, do something fun, stop being so serious all the time. So Sarah had reluctantly agreed, had dressed up and walked with her sister to the Miller Hotel, had paid the cover charge, and found a table near the back of the room. She was sitting with her back partially to the stage, not particularly interested in the music, more focused on her conversation with her sister, but positioned in such a way that she could see the mirrors behind the stage in her peripheral vision. The third witness was a musician named Willie Brown. He was 42 years old, a respected guitarist in his own right, who had known Robert Johnson for years, had been one of the older bluesmen who had witnessed Robert's mysterious transformation from mediocre player to supernatural talent. Willie was in Helena playing his own shows at various venues around town, and he had stopped by the Miller Hotel specifically to watch Robert play, to study his technique, to try once again to understand how Robert did what he did. Willie was standing near the bar area on the left side of the room, a position that gave him an angled view of the stage and the mirrors, a perspective that would prove crucial for what he was about to witness. The fourth witness was a man named Thomas Reed. He was 56 years old, worked as a barber in Helena, owned his own shop on Walnut Street. Thomas was a regular at the Miller Hotel's Friday night shows, came almost every week, enjoyed the music and the social atmosphere and the chance to see people outside of his barbershop. He knew Gus Miller personally, had cut his hair for years, and often got a good table near the front because of their friendship. Thomas was sitting at a table directly in front of the stage, maybe 10 feet from where Robert stood, close enough to see details clearly, close enough to notice things that someone further back might miss. The fifth witness was a young man named David Jackson, who everyone called Davy. He was 19 years old, worked at the Cotton Gin on the edge of town, lived with his parents and 4 siblings in a small house in Helena's black neighborhood. Davy loved music with the passionate intensity that 19-year-olds bring to things they love, and he had heard about Robert Johnson from older musicians, had heard the stories and the rumors, and wanted to experience this legendary player for himself. Davy was sitting at a table on the right side of the room, a position that gave him a clear view of the mirrors at an angle, a perspective slightly different from the other witnesses, but equally clear. These 5 people, James Crawford, Sarah Mitchell, Willie Brown, Thomas Reed, and David Jackson, had nothing in common beyond being in the Miller Hotel common room on that Friday night. Different ages, different occupations, different levels of interest in blues music, different reasons for being there. They were strangers to each other, wouldn't have any reason to coordinate their stories or agree on a shared narrative, which makes what they all witnessed, what they all reported seeing, what they all remembered consistently for the rest of their lives, even more significant. Because when five people who don't know each other all tell the same impossible story, you have to at least consider the possibility that the impossible thing actually happened. Robert Johnson finished tuning his guitar. The room quieted down as people noticed he was ready to begin. Conversations trailed off. People turned their chairs to face the stage. Gus Miller made a brief announcement welcoming everyone to the hotel, thanking them for coming out, introducing Robert Johnson, who needed no introduction but got one anyway, because that's what you did. That's how you showed respect to a performer. Robert nodded acknowledgement of the applause that greeted his name, stepped forward slightly on the small platform, and began to play. The first song was one of his own compositions, a blues with a driving rhythm and complex finger-picking that immediately grabbed the attention of everyone in the room. His fingers moved across the frets with that speed and precision that seemed impossible for one person to produce, creating bass lines and melodies and rhythm all at once, making the guitar sound like multiple instruments playing in coordination. His voice, when he started singing, was high and clear and full of emotion, cutting through the room, demanding attention even from people who had been skeptical about whether this young musician could possibly be as good as the stories claimed. And behind him, on the wall in those 5 mirrors, his reflection played along, fingers moving, body swaying slightly to the rhythm, the image doing exactly what you would expect a reflection to do. Except it wasn't quite right. James Crawford noticed it first, about 30 seconds into the first song. He was watching Robert play, impressed by the skill, but his eyes kept drifting to the mirrors behind the stage because he was sitting at an angle where he could see both Robert and his reflection without having to shift his gaze much. And something about the reflection bothered him, caught his attention in a way that made him focus on it more carefully. At first he couldn't identify what was wrong, couldn't put his finger on exactly what was creating the sense of unease. The reflection was there. It showed Robert Johnson standing on the stage playing guitar. It moved when Robert moved, seemed to correspond to what the physical Robert was doing, but there was a lag, just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable. But there, like the reflection was delayed slightly, like it was moving a beat behind the actual person. James watched more carefully, trying to confirm what he thought he was seeing, wondering if it was just an optical illusion created by the angle or the lighting or his own tired eyes after a long day of work. But no, it was real. The reflection was definitely lagging behind Robert's actual movements. When Robert's hand moved to a new position on the fretboard, the reflection's hand moved to the same position a fraction of a second later. When Robert's head tilted back as he sang a particularly emotional phrase, the reflection's head tilted back just after. The delay was small, maybe a quarter of a second, maybe less, but once James noticed it, he couldn't stop seeing it, couldn't focus on anything else. Sarah Mitchell noticed it maybe a minute into the song, though from her position she saw something slightly different. She wasn't paying much attention to the performance, was still talking to her sister in low voices that wouldn't disturb other audience members, but her eyes happened to glance at the mirrors, and she saw something that made her stop mid-sentence. The reflection in the center mirror, the one directly behind Robert, wasn't quite matching his movements. Not lagging from her perspective, but moving differently. Subtly but different. The angle of the head was wrong by a few degrees. The position of the shoulders wasn't quite right. Like the reflection was Robert Johnson, but not quite. Like it was a similar but not identical version of him, like someone had copied him but gotten some of the details wrong. Sarah stared at the mirror, her conversation forgotten, trying to understand what she was seeing. Her sister noticed her distraction and asked what was wrong, and Sarah just pointed at the mirror without saying anything, without being able to articulate what was bothering her. Her sister looked at the mirror, looked at Robert, looked back at the mirror, and shrugged, not seeing anything unusual, which made Sarah question her own perception, made her wonder if she was imagining things. But she kept watching, kept comparing the reflection to the reality, and the difference was there, subtle but persistent. Willie Brown noticed it about 2 minutes into the song. As a musician himself, Willie was watching Robert's hands closely, studying the fingering patterns, the picking technique, the way Robert created those complex sounds. And because he was focused on Robert's hands, he noticed when the reflection's hands didn't quite match. The fingers in the mirror were pressing down on different frets than the fingers on the actual guitar. Not by much, just by 1 or 2 frets, but wrong, playing different notes than what was actually being played. Willie frowned, shifted his position to get a better angle, looked again. The reflection's hands were still wrong. Were playing a song that was similar to what Robert was playing, but not identical, like a variation on the same theme, but with different notes. Thomas Reed noticed it maybe 3 minutes in, and what he saw was the most dramatic of all the witnesses' observations. From his position directly in front of the stage, Thomas could see all 5 mirrors behind Robert, could see 5 reflections of the same person, 5 images that should be identical, or nearly identical, depending on the angle. But they weren't. The reflection in the leftmost mirror was clear and normal, showing Robert Johnson playing his guitar, exactly as you would expect a reflection to show. But moving to the right, each subsequent mirror showed something slightly different. The second mirror showed a reflection that was slightly translucent, like you could almost see through it to the wall behind. The third mirror, the center one, showed a reflection that was darker than it should be, like Robert was standing in shadow even though the stage was well lit. The fourth mirror showed a reflection that was slightly blurred, out of focus, like the mirror needed cleaning or like the reflection itself was unclear about what it should be showing. And the fifth mirror, the rightmost one, showed a reflection that was moving independently, not just lagging or moving differently, but actually doing different things. While Robert stood relatively still between phrases, the reflection in the fifth mirror was moving, swaying, shifting weight from foot to foot, exhibiting restless energy that the actual person on stage wasn't showing. Thomas blinked, looked away, looked back. The differences were still there. 5 mirrors, 5 reflections, none of them quite right. None of them showing exactly what they should be showing. He felt his heart rate increase, felt a prickle of fear run down his spine, felt the room suddenly seem colder despite the September heat. David Jackson noticed it last, maybe 4 minutes into the first song, but what he saw was the most disturbing of all. Davy was watching Robert play with the uncritical enthusiasm of a 19-year-old who loved music and was witnessing a master at work. But his eyes drifted to the mirrors behind the stage because that's where eyes naturally drifted when you were sitting at an angle, because the mirrors reflected light and movement and drew attention. And in one of the mirrors, the fourth one from the left, Davy saw something that made his blood run cold. The reflection wasn't Robert Johnson. Oh, it was shaped like Robert Johnson, was in the same position, was holding a guitar and moving in ways that corresponded to what Robert was doing. But the face was wrong. The features were distorted, shifted, rearranged in subtle ways that made the reflection look like someone else, like something else, like Robert Johnson, if you had only heard him described and tried to create him from memory, but got the details wrong. Davy stared at the mirror, unable to look away, feeling sick to his stomach, wondering if he was losing his mind or if what he was seeing was real. Robert finished the first song. The room erupted in applause. People cheered, called out encouragement, demanded more. Robert nodded acknowledgement, took a sip of water from a glass on the edge of the stage, and launched immediately into a second song. And behind him, the reflections continued their strange behavior. James Crawford watched the lag in the center mirror become more pronounced. The reflection was now a full second behind Robert's actual movements, creating a disjointed effect where you could see the action and then see it repeated in the mirror, like an echo, like time itself was stuttering. Sarah Mitchell watched the angles and positions continue to drift, watched the reflection become less and less accurate until it looked like someone imitating Robert Johnson rather than being Robert Johnson, like a puppet show where the puppeteer wasn't quite skilled enough to make the movement convincing. Willie Brown watched the hands in the reflection play increasingly different music, until what he saw in the mirror bore no relationship to what Robert was actually playing, until the reflection was performing an entirely different song with different chords and different rhythm and different emotional tone. Thomas Reed watched the 5 reflections become more and more distinct from each other. The translucent reflection in the second mirror became more transparent, fading until it was barely visible, until you could see the wall behind it clearly. The dark reflection in the third mirror became darker still, until it was just a silhouette, a shape, without features or details. The blurred reflection in the fourth mirror lost all clarity, became just a vague human-shaped smudge. And the independent reflection in the fifth mirror started doing things that Robert wasn't doing at all. Started walking back and forth on the small stage area shown in the mirror, started gesturing with its free hand, started opening its mouth to sing when Robert's mouth was closed. David Jackson watched the wrong-faced reflection in the fourth mirror become more distorted, more wrong, until it didn't look human anymore, until it looked like something that had only studied humans from a distance and was trying to approximate one without fully understanding the details. And then, during the second song, approximately 6 minutes into Robert Johnson's performance, the impossible thing that all 5 witnesses would remember most clearly happened. The reflection in the rightmost mirror, the fifth mirror, the one that had been moving independently, stopped moving, just froze. While Robert Johnson continued playing, continued moving, continued performing, the reflection in the fifth mirror stood perfectly still, like it had been paused, like someone had taken a photograph and placed it in the mirror instead of a live reflection. The stillness lasted for maybe 10 seconds while Robert played on, and then the reflection simply faded. Didn't disappear all at once, didn't wink out like a candle flame being extinguished, but faded gradually over the course of 3 or 4 seconds until the fifth mirror showed only the wall behind the stage, showed the empty stage platform, showed everything that should be reflected except Robert Johnson himself. The mirror still worked. It still showed the room, still reflected light and objects and movement, but it no longer showed Robert. His reflection was simply gone from that mirror, erased, removed, as if he wasn't there at all. James Crawford saw it happen, stopped breathing for a moment, leaned forward in his chair, stared at the mirror that no longer contained a reflection of the performer standing directly in front of it. Sarah Mitchell saw it happen, gasped audibly, loud enough that her sister asked what was wrong, loud enough that a few people at nearby tables turned to look at her. Willie Brown saw it happen, felt every muscle in his body tense, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, felt a primal fear response that came from some deep evolutionary place that recognized wrongness, even if the conscious mind couldn't immediately process what that wrongness meant. Thomas Reed saw it happen, pressed back in his chair involuntarily, as if trying to get further away from the stage, from Robert Johnson, from whatever was happening up there that violated natural law so completely. David Jackson saw it happen, made a small sound in his throat, half gasp and half whimper, and had to grip the edge of the table to keep himself from standing up and leaving the room immediately. And then the second mirror lost its reflection, the one that had been showing the translucent image. The image had been fading throughout the performance, becoming more transparent, more ghost-like, and now it faded completely, disappeared, left the second mirror showing only the empty stage and the wall behind it. 2 mirrors now reflecting everything except Robert Johnson. 2 mirrors that should have shown his image but didn't, that created an impossible void, a selective blindness that made no sense according to any law of physics or optics that the witnesses understood. Robert Johnson continued playing, seemingly unaware of what was happening behind him, absorbed in his music, eyes closed during certain phrases, focused inward rather than outward. He showed no sign of knowing that his reflections were behaving impossibly, that 2 of the 5 mirrors on the wall behind him were now blank of his image, that something profoundly wrong was manifesting in that common room at the Miller Hotel. The 3rd mirror lost its reflection next, the one that had been showing the dark silhouette. The darkness that had been consuming the image grew darker still, became absolute, became a black shape in the mirror that had no features, no details, no humanity, and then that darkness faded too, dissolved into nothing, left the 3rd mirror reflecting everything except the person standing directly in front of it. 3 mirrors blank, 3 mirrors showing an impossible absence. The audience continued watching Robert play, most of them unaware of what was happening with the mirrors behind the stage, focused on the music and the performance, on Robert's fingers flying across the frets and his voice soaring through the room. Only the 5 witnesses, who had been paying attention to the reflections, who had noticed the wrongness from the beginning and had been unable to look away, understood that something impossible was occurring. James Crawford stood up from his table. He didn't plan to, didn't make a conscious decision to stand, just found himself on his feet, needing to move closer, needing to verify what he was seeing, needing to confirm that 3 of the 5 mirrors on the wall behind Robert Johnson were reflecting everything in the room except Robert Johnson himself. He moved toward the stage, weaving between tables, keeping his eyes fixed on the mirrors. Other people noticed him standing, moving, and a few heads turned to watch him, curious about what he was doing, but most attention remained on Robert and his performance. Sarah Mitchell stood up too, drawn by the same compulsion to get closer, to understand, to verify. Her sister grabbed her arm, asked where she was going, but Sarah shook her off gently and moved toward the stage from her position at the back of the room. Willie Brown was already moving before he consciously decided to, the musician in him needing to investigate this phenomenon, needing to understand what was happening, even if understanding proved impossible. Thomas Reed stayed seated, but leaned forward as far as he could, eyes moving from Robert to the mirrors and back again, trying to find some explanation, some rational cause for what he was witnessing. David Jackson wanted to leave, wanted to run out of the room and away from whatever wrongness was manifesting here, but found himself unable to move, paralyzed by a combination of fear and fascination, rooted to his chair while his hands gripped the table edge hard enough that his knuckles turned white. The 4th mirror lost its reflection. The blurred image that had been losing clarity throughout the performance finally faded completely, leaving only a clear reflection of the empty stage and wall. 4 mirrors now showing Robert Johnson's absence. 4 impossible voids in surfaces that should reflect everything in front of them, but somehow, selectively, didn't. And then the 5th and final mirror, the center one, the last one still showing Robert's image, began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, the reflection becoming lighter, more transparent, less solid, like it was being erased from the bottom up, like someone was slowly removing it from the mirror using an invisible cloth. The room had grown quieter during the 2nd song, people gradually becoming aware that something was wrong, that the usual atmosphere of a Friday night music show had shifted into something else, something tense and strange, even if most people couldn't identify exactly what was creating that feeling. A few people near the stage had noticed the blank mirrors by now, had seen what James Crawford and the others were staring at, and confusion was spreading through the audience like a slow wave, people whispering to each other, pointing, trying to understand. Robert Johnson played on. His eyes were open now, but he wasn't looking at the audience, wasn't looking at anything in the room. His gaze was fixed on some point in the middle distance, some place that existed only in his mind, or his memory, or some other realm entirely. His playing had intensified, become more urgent, more emotionally raw, like he was pouring everything he had into the music, like the song was the only thing keeping him anchored to this room, to this moment, to this world. The last reflection faded completely. All 5 mirrors on the wall behind the stage now showed the room, showed the stage, showed the wooden platform and the wall and the space where Robert Johnson stood. But they didn't show Robert Johnson himself. He was invisible in the mirrors. Present in every other way. Visible to the naked eye, solid and real and undeniably there, but creating no reflection, leaving no image in the glass, existing in a state that shouldn't be possible according to every law of nature that governed how light and reflection and perception worked. James Crawford reached the front of the room, stood maybe 5 feet from the stage and stared at the mirrors. From this close, the impossibility was even more apparent. He could see Robert Johnson clearly, could see every detail of his face and hands and body, could turn his head and look at the mirrors and see nothing, could look back at Robert and see him. The disconnect between what his eyes reported from looking directly at the person and what they reported from looking at the mirrors was so profound that it created a kind of vertigo. A dizziness that came from confronting something that his brain insisted couldn't exist. Sarah Mitchell reached the front from the other direction, came to stand next to James Crawford, though they didn't acknowledge each other, didn't speak, both too focused on what they were witnessing to engage in social interaction. Sarah's breathing was shallow and fast, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing through possible explanations and finding none that fit. Willie Brown stood to the left, slightly apart from the others, his musician's mind trying to find some connection between Robert's playing and the disappearing reflections, trying to understand if the music was causing this or if something else entirely was responsible. Thomas Reed remained at his table, but had turned his chair completely around, back to the rest of the room, focused entirely on the stage and the mirrors and the impossible thing happening there. David Jackson finally managed to move, finally broke free of the paralysis that had held him, and he didn't move toward the stage, moved instead toward the door, needed to leave, needed to get away, but found himself stopping at the threshold, unable to actually exit, unable to leave, before seeing how this resolved, how this impossible situation would end. Robert Johnson finished the second song. Let the final notes ring out, sustain, fade into silence. And in that silence, in the pause before applause could start, before people could react, Robert turned around. Slowly, deliberately, turned to face the wall behind the stage, to face the 5 mirrors that should have shown his reflection but didn't. He looked at them. His face showed no surprise, no shock, no confusion. Just a deep sadness, a resignation, an acceptance of something he had known would happen, or perhaps had known was happening all along. He stared at those blank mirrors for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, and then he turned back to face the audience. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the faces staring back at him, seeing the confusion and fear and incomprehension written there. His gaze settled on the 5 people standing or positioned nearest to the stage. The 5 who had been watching most carefully, the 5 who had witnessed the entire sequence of his reflections disappearing one by one. James Crawford, Sarah Mitchell, Willie Brown, Thomas Reed, David Jackson, 5 witnesses who would carry this memory for the rest of their lives. Robert spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent room. "I don't cast reflections no more," he said simply. "Haven't for about 6 months now. Started with one mirror not showing me, then another, then all of them. Don't know why. Don't know how to fix it. Don't know what it means exactly, though I got my suspicions." He paused, looked down at his guitar, ran his hand across the strings without plucking them, creating a faint shimmering sound that was barely audible. "I made a choice a while back. Wanted something bad enough to trade for it. Got what I wanted, playing guitar better than I ever thought I could. But turns out, what you trade ain't always what you think you're trading. Turns out some trades got consequences that keep unfolding, keep revealing themselves in ways you didn't anticipate." He looked back up at the audience. "I'm disappearing from mirrors, from reflections, maybe from photographs too, I don't know, haven't tried. It's like I'm being erased from places where image exists without substance, like whatever I traded included the right to have my image captured and held, like I'm becoming something that can only exist in the moment, in the flesh, in the here and now, but can't be reflected or recorded or remembered in any way except memory. The room remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone was processing what Robert had said, what they had witnessed, trying to reconcile the impossible thing they had seen with the explanation that somehow made it even more disturbing. Robert set his guitar down carefully, leaning it against the wall beside the stage. "I think I'm done playing tonight," he said. "Don't feel right continuing after that. Don't feel right pretending everything's normal when clearly it ain't. Gus, I'm sorry for cutting the show short. Keep whatever money from the door. I don't need payment for 2 songs. He stepped down from the stage, picked up his guitar case, placed his instrument inside, with the reverent care that musicians show their tools, closed the case and latched it. Then he walked toward the door of the common room, moving through the crowd that parted before him like water, people stepping back instinctively, creating space around him, around this person who had just demonstrated that he existed outside normal rules, outside natural law. Robert reached the door where David Jackson stood. The young man pressed himself against the wall to let Robert pass, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. Robert paused, looked at Davy, and his expression softened slightly. "Don't be scared of me, son," Robert said quietly. "I'm just a man who made a bad trade and is living with the consequences. Ain't no monster, ain't no demon. Just a fool who wanted something too much and paid too high a price for it." Then he was gone, walking through the doorway, across the hotel lobby, up the stairs to room 23, where he would spend the night before leaving Helena the next morning. The common room remained silent for several long seconds after Robert's departure. Then, slowly, people began to talk. Quietly at first, then with increasing volume and agitation. What had just happened? Had they all seen the same thing? Were the mirrors broken? Was this some kind of trick, some stagecraft illusion that Robert had arranged to add drama to his performance? But the 5 witnesses who had watched most carefully, who had seen the reflections behave strangely from the beginning, and then fade one by one until all 5 mirrors showed nothing, they knew it wasn't a trick, knew it was real, knew they had witnessed something that shouldn't be possible, but was. James Crawford walked to the mirrors, stood in front of them, saw his own reflection clearly, perfectly normally. The mirrors worked. They reflected him, reflected the room, reflected everything as they should. They just hadn't reflected Robert Johnson, had refused to show his image, had created a selective blindness that targeted one specific person while continuing to function normally for everything and everyone else. Sarah Mitchell joined James at the mirrors, looked at her own reflection, saw it clearly, looked at James's reflection, saw it beside her own. Everything normal, everything working as physics said it should, except for what they had just witnessed, except for the impossibility that they had seen with their own eyes and couldn't deny or explain. Willie Brown came over, looked at the mirrors, tested them by moving back and forth to see his reflection move accordingly. Normal. Perfectly normal, which made what had happened with Robert's reflection even more disturbing, even more impossible to rationalize away. Thomas Reed stood up from his table, walked to the stage area, examined the mirrors from different angles. He touched one of them, felt the cool glass under his palm, saw his hand reflected back at him. Real mirrors. Real glass, real silver backing creating real reflections, everything as it should be, everything normal. David Jackson stayed by the door, didn't approach the mirrors, didn't want to get any closer to the place where the impossible thing had manifested. But he watched the others examine the mirrors, saw them testing and confirming that the mirrors worked normally, and he knew what they were discovering. That the mirrors weren't broken, that the impossibility wasn't in the objects, but in Robert Johnson himself, in whatever he had become, in whatever his reflection's disappearance signified about his relationship with the physical world. Gus Miller emerged from his office, having heard from staff that the show had ended abruptly and the musician had left. He looked around at his customers, saw the agitation and confusion, saw the small group gathered around the mirrors at the front of the room. "What happened?" Gus asked, directing his question to the room in general, but looking specifically at James Crawford, who seemed to be one of the people most invested in understanding what had occurred. James looked at Gus, tried to find words, struggled for a moment, then said simply, "Robert Johnson doesn't have a reflection. We all saw it. Well, 5 of us watched it happen from the beginning. Watched his reflections in these mirrors disappear one by one while he was playing, until none of the mirrors showed him, even though he was standing right there in front of them." Gus frowned, looked at the mirrors, looked at James like he might be drunk or crazy, looked around at the other faces and saw that many people were nodding, confirming this impossible story. "That's not possible," Gus said, but his voice lacked conviction because he could see in the faces of his customers that they believed what they were saying, that they had witnessed something that had shaken them profoundly. The story spread through Helena that night and into the next day. By Sunday, everyone in the black community knew about what had happened at the Miller Hotel. Robert Johnson, the legendary bluesman, had no reflection, had played a show where his image had disappeared from mirrors while he stood in front of them. 5 people had watched it happen from start to finish. Others had noticed it partway through. Multiple witnesses confirming an impossible event. The story reached Gus Miller's wife, who had been visiting her sister that Friday night and hadn't been at the hotel. She insisted that Gus get rid of the mirrors, convinced that they were cursed, that Robert Johnson's presence had contaminated them somehow. Gus refused, pointing out that the mirrors were working perfectly normally, that they had reflected everyone else in the room just fine, that the issue wasn't with the mirrors, but with Robert Johnson himself. The mirrors stayed on the wall behind the stage, and musicians continued to play at the Miller Hotel on Friday and Saturday nights. But for months afterward, every performer would turn and check the mirrors before starting their set, would verify that their reflection was there, would reassure themselves that they were normal, that whatever afflicted Robert Johnson hadn't somehow transferred to them. The 5 primary witnesses, James Crawford, Sarah Mitchell, Willie Brown, Thomas Reed, and David Jackson, became known in Helena as the people who had seen the impossible, who had watched Robert Johnson lose his reflections in real time. They were sought out by others who wanted to hear the story directly, who wanted details, who wanted confirmation or contradiction of what they had heard through the grapevine. The 5 told their stories separately, without coordinating, and their accounts were remarkably consistent. All 5 described watching the reflections behave strangely from early in the performance. All 5 described the sequence of mirrors going blank, though they saw it from different angles and noticed different aspects of the wrongness. All 5 confirmed that by the end of the second song, none of the 5 mirrors on the wall behind the stage showed Robert Johnson's reflection, even though the mirrors clearly worked and showed everything else normally. James Crawford was interviewed by a folklorist in 1952, 14 years after the event. The interview was recorded, and the transcript still exists. When asked to describe what he saw, James said, "I was there. I watched the whole thing happen. Started with the reflection lagging a bit behind his actual movements, which I thought was strange, but maybe explainable by lighting or angle. But then it got worse. The reflection started showing him wrong, started not matching what he was actually doing, and then they started disappearing, one mirror at a time, until all 5 mirrors on that wall were blank of his image. I stood right in front of those mirrors after he left. They worked fine. Reflected me, reflected everyone else, worked exactly like mirrors are supposed to work. They just didn't reflect Robert Johnson. And I can't explain that, don't have any scientific or rational explanation for it. All I can tell you is what I saw with my own eyes." Sarah Mitchell was interviewed by a local historian in 1963, 25 years after the event. She was 62 years old by then, a grandmother, a respected member of her church community. When asked if she still believed what she claimed to have seen that night, if maybe time had distorted the memory, or if she might have been mistaken, Sarah's response was firm and immediate. "I know what I saw," she said. "I was sitting at an angle where I could see the mirrors clearly. I watched Robert Johnson's reflection become less and less accurate, less and less like him, until it disappeared entirely, and I wasn't alone. There were 4 other people who saw the same thing I saw, and dozens more who noticed partway through. You can't dismiss that many witnesses. You can't explain away that many people all reporting the same impossible thing. It happened. Robert Johnson had no reflection, and that means something, though I'm not entirely sure what, but it means something about the state of his soul, about what he had become, about the price he had paid for his talent." Willie Brown, who knew Robert Johnson personally and would outlive him by many years, spoke about that night in Helena in numerous interviews throughout his life. In a 1967 interview, Willie said, "I saw a lot of strange things around Robert, things that didn't make sense, things that suggested his talent came from somewhere that wasn't entirely natural. But that night at the Miller Hotel was the most dramatic, the most impossible to dismiss, because it wasn't just me seeing it. It was 5 of us watching from the start, and more people noticing as it went on. We all saw his reflections disappear, all saw those mirrors go blank where his image should have been. And Robert knew. When he turned around and looked at those mirrors and saw nothing looking back, he wasn't surprised. He was sad, maybe resigned, but not surprised, like he'd expected this. Like it was just another consequence of whatever bargain he'd made, another piece of himself being taken as payment. Thomas Reed, interviewed in 1971 when he was 89 years old, said, "I've seen a lot in my life, lived through a lot. But that night stands out as the strangest, the most unsettling thing I ever witnessed, because mirrors aren't supposed to be selective. They're just physics, just light reflecting off a surface. They don't choose what to show and what not to show. But those mirrors chose not to show Robert Johnson. Or maybe Robert Johnson had become something that mirrors couldn't show. Either way, it was wrong. It violated how the world is supposed to work. And it scared me. Still scares me when I think about it all these years later. Because if that's possible, if a person can lose their reflection, can become invisible to mirrors while remaining visible to the naked eye, what else is possible? What other laws of nature can be violated? What other impossible things exist that we just haven't witnessed yet? David Jackson, interviewed in 1975 when he was 57 years old, said, "I was 19 when I saw it. Just a kid, really. And it marked me, changed how I saw the world, because up until that night I believed in rules, believed the world made sense, operated according to principles I could understand, even if I hadn't learned them all yet. But watching Robert Johnson's reflection disappear from those mirrors, watching the impossible happen right in front of me, that shattered my certainty. Made me realize the world is stranger than we're taught, contains mysteries we don't understand and maybe can't understand. Some people might find that frightening, and it was frightening at first, but eventually I found it liberating. Found comfort in knowing there's more to existence than what science and rational thought can explain. Found meaning in mystery. Robert Johnson died 11 months after the incident at the Miller Hotel on August 16, 1938. He was 27 years old. In the months between the Helena show and his death, he continued traveling and playing throughout the Delta and beyond. Some people who attended his shows in those final months reported noticing strange things about mirrors and reflections when Robert was present, though none described it happening as dramatically or as completely as the 5 witnesses in Helena had reported. There were rumors of mirrors in other venues showing Robert's image incorrectly, showing him distorted or delayed or darker than he should appear. There were reports of Robert avoiding mirrors when possible, not looking at reflective surfaces, turning away from windows at night when they became mirrors, reflecting the interior of rooms. There were stories of Robert speaking about his lack of reflection to close friends, though those conversations were private and the details were never fully shared with outsiders. One of the most consistent stories from Robert's final months came from multiple sources and seemed reliable enough to be taken seriously. Robert had stopped having his photograph taken. In the last year of his life, he refused every request to pose for pictures, turned down offers from people who wanted to document his performances, avoided cameras the way he avoided mirrors. When asked why, he apparently told one person, "What's the point of taking a picture if I won't be in it?" suggesting that his lack of reflection had extended to photography as well, that whatever made him invisible to mirrors also made him invisible to cameras. After Robert's death, the folklore around him grew and evolved, incorporating the mirror incident among many other stories about his life and talent and the supernatural elements that seemed to follow him. The story of the 5 witnesses at the Miller Hotel became one of the most well-documented claims of supernatural occurrence associated with Robert, because unlike many other stories that existed only as rumors or second-hand accounts, this one had multiple named witnesses who told consistent stories and stuck to those stories for decades. The incident has been analyzed by researchers and skeptics and believers, all trying to understand what really happened that night. Skeptics have proposed various explanations. Maybe the mirrors were defective, had dead spots in their silver backing that created areas where reflection didn't occur, and Robert happened to be standing in those dead spots. But this doesn't explain why the reflections started normally and then disappeared, why they showed Robert at first and then stopped showing him. Doesn't explain why all 5 mirrors developed this problem simultaneously. Doesn't explain why the mirrors worked perfectly normally for everyone else who stood in the same spots afterward. Maybe it was a trick, some kind of stagecraft illusion that Robert had arranged using special mirrors or lighting or other techniques, but the mirrors belonged to the hotel, had been there for years, weren't special in any way. And Robert gave no indication of having planned this, seemed disturbed by it when it was pointed out to him, explained it as something happening to him rather than something he was doing deliberately. Maybe it was mass hysteria, 5 people convincing themselves and each other that they saw something that didn't actually happen. Their expectations and beliefs about Robert Johnson creating a shared hallucination. But the witnesses didn't know each other beforehand, had no reason to collaborate on a false story, maintained their accounts independently for decades without coordination. Believers in the supernatural have their own interpretations. Some say Robert's lack of reflection proved he had no soul, that he had indeed sold it to the devil, and the absence of reflection was physical evidence of that spiritual loss. In vampire folklore, the undead cast no reflection because they have no soul, and perhaps the same logic applied to Robert. Some say the lack of reflection indicated Robert was trapped between worlds, between the living and the dead, between the natural and the supernatural, and mirrors which show truth couldn't fully capture someone who existed in that liminal state. Some say it was a warning, a sign that Robert's time was running out, that the price for his bargain was about to be collected and his image was being erased from the world in preparation for his complete removal. Some say it was punishment, that whatever entity had given Robert his talent was taking back other things in return, starting with his reflection and eventually taking his life. All of these interpretations try to make sense of the impossible, try to fit it into some framework of understanding, whether scientific or spiritual or folkloric. But maybe the truth is simpler and more disturbing. Maybe Robert Johnson had become something that mirrors couldn't or wouldn't show. Maybe he had crossed some line through his actions or his bargain that removed him from the natural order enough that objects which depend on natural law to function couldn't fully interact with him. Maybe he was being erased from existence gradually, starting with his inability to cast reflections, and his death 11 months later was just the final stage of that erasure. Or maybe it's a mystery that can't be solved, that shouldn't be solved, that exists to remind us that the world contains things beyond our comprehension, that the boundaries of possible and impossible are more flexible than we like to believe. The Miller Hotel operated for another 30 years after that September night in 1937. The common room continued to host musicians and audiences, continued to serve as a social hub for Helena's black community. The 5 mirrors remained on the wall behind the stage, serving their purpose, reflecting performers and audiences and light and movement just as they always had. But everyone who played that stage checked those mirrors. Everyone verified their reflection was there. Everyone remembered the night when Robert Johnson's wasn't. The hotel closed in 1967, a victim of changing times and integration that made segregated establishments obsolete. The building was sold, converted to other uses, eventually fell into disrepair. The mirrors were removed at some point, sold or discarded or claimed by individuals. Their current location is unknown. They're out there somewhere, 5 large mirrors in dark wood frames that once showed the impossible absence of Robert Johnson's reflection. Or maybe they're just mirrors, objects with no special properties, and the impossibility that night had nothing to do with them, and everything to do with the man who stood in front of them. This is the story of September 3rd, 1937, when 5 people watched Robert Johnson's reflection disappear from every mirror in a room at the Miller Hotel in Helena, Arkansas. The story of an impossible event witnessed by multiple people who never wavered in their testimony. The story of a man who had lost something fundamental, something that connected him to the normal world, and who knew he was losing it and could do nothing to stop it. Whether you believe this story represents genuine supernatural occurrence, or mass delusion or misperception or something else entirely, the historical record is clear. 5 named witnesses told consistent stories. The event was documented in interviews and records. Something happened that night that 5 people found inexplicable and terrifying. And 11 months later, Robert Johnson was dead, leaving behind a legacy of music and mystery and stories like this one that challenge our understanding of what's possible and what's real. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for considering the possibility that Robert Johnson's legend is built on more than just exceptional talent, that the supernatural elements aren't just embellishment, but might be rooted in genuine, unexplained phenomena that multiple people witnessed. Whether the lack of reflection was evidence of a soul bargain or a sign of something else entirely, it remains one of the most disturbing and well-documented strange occurrences in blues history. 5 witnesses, 5 consistent testimonies, 1 impossible event. And somewhere in that impossibility lies a truth about Robert Johnson that we may never fully understand but cannot completely dismiss.